calculations. Does it create havoc every time it comes by?
A completely new paradigm.
Doug, welcome back. Good to have you.
Thanks for having me back.
Lots of things going on this planet these days, huh?
Absolutely. Getting more interesting all the time.
My gosh. Hey, you're publishing a new news magazine, I hear.
Yes, right. It's called the DuPage Guardian at DuPageGuardian.com. We're going to start doing more of a principled conservative magazine, I'm calling it. It's more about principles rather than politics. We're talking about news from the perspective of Chicago area, DuPage County specifically. And go ahead and check it out, DuPageGuardian.com.
Lots to talk with you about, but let's get into Planet X. And tell me, what motivated you to write a book on Planet X, Douglas?
Planet X, back when I was in college, I was looking for signs of the second coming of Jesus. And I was wondering, one of the passages regarding the end times, when he said he would return, was in Matthew 24:30. He said there would be a great heavenly sign that would precede his second coming. It's like a star-like apparition, or maybe a planet. And I looked at all the possible solutions for what that could possibly be. And I thought it could be either a star, like a supernova, a conjunction of planets, or maybe a comet. Those are also the same theories about the Star of Bethlehem, which preceded his first coming. And so I kind of equated the first coming of Christ with his second coming to say, well, is this the same object or not? And I looked at all the various options for the Star of Bethlehem, which had a similar kind of feel to it. But none of them really fit. And so I gave up on this search, realizing nothing really fit that we were aware of. But then I stumbled upon this book in the library. I was going to Southern Illinois University at the time. And they had a copy of Zecharia Sitchin's The 12th Planet. And it just totally opened my mind to the possibilities of a completely new paradigm. If there was, in fact, a 12th planet or a 10th planet, depending on how you count them, in our solar system, this would answer a lot of questions, not only about the creation, the birth of Jesus, and also the end times, and how they're all linked together through this mysterious Planet X with its mysterious orbit that takes it in and out of our solar system, I believe, every 2,000 years.
And Sitchin talked about it as a 3,600-year cycle, of course, but how close do you think he is to being accurate about the whole concept of Planet X?
I think the concept, he did a genius-level job of figuring out how the Enuma Elish, or the Babylonian creation epic, was actually a description of the creation of our solar system and of the sun and the planets and how they interacted early on, and how things were kind of chaotic. And his description of the Sumerians called it this great vast sea was actually makes a lot of sense, because when our sun was forming, it started forming out of a vast nebula of gas and dust. And as like all stars, actually, we can see this sort of process forming all throughout our galaxy. Stars are created from nebula, which were through a collective gravity, they kind of pulled together into a sphere of gas and dust that's compressed. As it becomes more and more compressed due to collective gravity, it begins to spin, and it starts to form what's called a solar nebula. And so it looks something like a giant version of Saturn with a huge ring. So that ring is billions of miles wide and goes all the way out to where we have planet Neptune right now, which is a very long way from the sun. But once the gas and dust compress to a certain point where fusion reactions could take place, the sun exploded into life, and there was what was called a T-Tauri wind, which blew away all the remaining gas and dust that hadn't formed into planets. And what we have left are the current planets we have today. And this sort of thing was actually very closely, very similar description of the scientific version of how the sun and planets were formed, very, very similar to the Enuma Elish account, which was written thousands of years earlier, which was based on traditions even more thousands of years older, to the point where some people believe that God actually gave mankind an understanding of how the sun and planets were all created. But over time it became mythological and kind of vague. But if you understand how things actually work in science, the Sumerians are actually remarkably accurate. Even the number of planets, or gods as they called them, in the solar system matches perfectly the number of planets in our solar system.
That's right.
Even including the concept that the planet Pluto was not an original member, but actually an escaped satellite of another planet.
Sitchin, of course, talked about the Anunnaki on this extra planet that came here and literally seeded us. Do you accept that part of his theory, too?
Yes, I think that his theory about Planet X is based on real science and scientific theory. The hunt for Planet X has been going on for over a century now. And so he inherited an already rich kind of research from mainstream scientists and kind of worked it into his Planet X Enuma Elish theory. And so I don't know if he already knew about it. He was actually inheritor of ancient creation. He was actually from Azerbaijan area, I believe, and which is not too far away from Persia. And he may have inherited some of the traditions of the ancient Magi. And so one of my theories is that he actually had an ancient tradition in hand, which he published as a part of maybe a timed release of important information from the future that they had planned on doing from ancient times. And he did so after the Planet X had been rediscovered, at least theoretically. And so he married that idea and kind of figured out what they were talking about, put it together with the science and said, you know what, this must be what our ancient ancestors are talking about from their traditions, and put it together, the brilliant Planet X book. Not a perfect book. I mean, people like Mike Kaiser differ with the quality of his interpretations, which is fine, and he's right. I mean, he wasn't a professional scholar. But I think his basic idea was brilliance, and it was so good, it must have been based on a tradition that was already extant, because I can't imagine anyone, even a genius, coming up with something that brilliant. The interpretation was completely out of left field, and it blindsided all the scholars in the field who all thought it was just like this uniformitarian description of natural processes, but actually applying the idea of Enuma Elish being how the actual sun and planets were formed had never been attempted. And so I gave him credit in my book. In chapter 4, I believe it was, I gave that entire chapter to his interpretation, because it was influential to me and to many others. And I still think that he was basically accurate in his assessment that the Sumerians were aware in a fair amount of detail how our solar system actually was created, maybe more so than we understand today.
And Sitchin, of course, has believed, and you believe, that the Planet X could also have been the Star of Bethlehem that the Bible talks about.
Right. It makes sense. I call it the 2,000-year orbit because every 2,000 years or so, there's a major star appears in the heavens. 2,000 years ago, it was the Star of Bethlehem. 2,000 years before that, it was the star, I believe it was in the apocryphal book, The Testament of Abraham, or one of those books. Abraham was actually preceded by a star in the heavens. And, of course, the Sumerians, 2,000 years later, worshipped the great star in the heavens as Anu, or Enlil. Every 2,000 years, we seem to have a major interaction between God and men, which is heralded by a star.
Let's talk about end times prophecy for a moment, then we're going to get into it in a bigger way toward the end of this program tonight, Doug. But how close do you I'm fascinated by end times prophecy because of how it was developed and where it's taking this planet. And it just seems like too many signs are out there that match what end times has talked about in the Bible.
That's right.
Does that scare you?
Actually, I mean specifically about Planet X or any kind of sign?
Any sign.
Well, one of the more interesting signs I've looked at is the Revelation 12 sign. Maybe you've heard of this, where there was a conjunction of planets in the constellation of Virgo back in 2017. And that actually matched the description of the heavenly sign in Revelation 12, where there's the woman appears in the sky with a clove of the sun and the moon at her feet and a crown of 12 stars. Well, that actually happened back in September 23, 2017. It was during the day, so you couldn't see it, but the woman, Virgo, had the sun in its body, the moon at its feet, and a crown of 12 stars, including the planets Mercury, Venus, and Mars, that appeared over its head, just like it's described in the book of Revelation. Now, that particular conjunction has happened before, but which marks it as, I think, the sign of the book of Revelation, the actual fulfillment of it, was that at the same time, and people forget the second part of the sign, there in Revelation 12, after that sign, it's described how the dragon dragged one-third of the stars down with his tail. Now, what happens after those three stars, or three planets, conjunct over the head of Virgo, one of the planets goes down, and following the tail of the constellation of Hydra, which is right next to Virgo, and Hydra is, of course, a dragon. And just as the tail of the Hydra goes beneath the horizon, the planet Mars follows it down to the horizon as well, almost as if it was being dragged down by the tail. So the assumption was that it was talking about all the stars in the heaven, but I think what they meant was one-third of the planets that were in that conjunction. So Mars went down while Mercury and Venus went up. And so I think that secondary sign indicates that the 2017 conjunction was the correct one. And there was an additional sign that was interesting to me when I looked at it in the star map. I think it was Stellarium or something like that. Just as the planet Mars went below the horizon and disappeared, President Trump declared Jerusalem as the indivisible permanent capital of Israel. And so it was right as the dragon's tail pulled Mars down beneath the horizon, which to me, I just thought that was a certainty of the sign was true.
Interesting parallel, wasn't it?
Yes, it was.
And, of course, we're going to talk later on about giants with Doug and the riddle of the Sphinx, and also he's got some thoughts on just what's happening in Europe right now and how that ties into biblical prophecy as well. The planet now, you say the planet comes around every 2,000 years. Sitchin predicted 3,600. Based on your numbers, Doug, where might it be right now?
If it's going to be 2,000 years for us, it's probably approaching the inner solar system. The problem is with Planet X, if it is what I think it is, it's effectively, in appearance, a giant comet. And it's a planet-sized comet. What happens with comets is they're actually, most of them are covered with a thick black organic tar-like goo, which has organic elements and proteins in it, which is interesting. And that's why you really can't see comets until their tails flare up, and that usually doesn't happen until they approach the sun. So the solar wind begins to heat up and vaporize the water on their surface. Before that, they're blacker than coal and cannot be seen by the naked eye. I suspect that Planet X is something similar. And when Jesus says, "Behold, I come like a thief in the night," basically Planet X is covered with this dark black material, or maybe miraculously it's in orbit around it. Probably when it destroyed Earth with one of its satellites and moved it to its current position closer to the sun, a massive amount of crustal material and dust and gases was thrown up into space, and Planet X flew right through it and picked it up in its orbit. And to this day, all that material is still in orbit around it, basically a huge black shroud which absorbs all light and prevents anyone from seeing the planet until it comes close enough for the water circulating around it to begin to sublimate and form its huge comet-like wings and tail. And so as soon as it comes close enough to the sun to start that process, it'll flare into glorious life and be extremely bright. But before that, it's basically impossible to see, except for with maybe very advanced infrared or similar telescopes.
Doug, they say the moon was created by pieces of the Earth that broke off when we collided with something. Might this have been the collision with Planet X?
Yeah, my theory was that the giant impact theory, which is a mainstream theory which explains how the moon was formed and is considered to be the definitive theory. Basically, in the giant impact theory, there's a Mars-sized object, not Mars itself, but an object about that size in our calculations and our supercomputer simulations that strikes the Earth at an angle. That object embedded itself in Earth's core, where it is today, actually, which explains why the Earth's core is a little bit off. And in the process, the mantle became molten and was literally shot into space where it formed and cooled into a sphere, which is now our moon. And our theory is that when Earth was forming, it was a series of smaller objects called planetesimals, which kind of crashed together and formed the final Earth, and that's how planets are generally formed. My theory is this actually was caused by the satellite of Planet X that struck Earth. It actually one of the satellites of Planet X, and that explains why in Enuma Elish, why this the great god of the Babylonians, the Marduk, was described as having shot an arrow into the dragon Tiamat's body. What that was symbolically saying this planet, which intruded into our solar system, struck Earth with one of its satellites, Earth being symbolized by the dragon Tiamat, the water goddess, who, Earth being a watery body, it was symbolized by a dragon who, instead of spewing fire, would spew water. It's very interesting symbology. And so probably that was not caused by a planetesimal. It was caused by one or more satellites that struck Earth as Planet X passed by. Planet X not only struck Earth and caused the creation of the Earth. That also caused the creation of the asteroids and the comets, and probably most, if not all, of the loose material in the inner solar system. Much of it remained in the Earth's original orbit in the asteroid belt. And based on Sitchin's interpretation of Enuma Elish, a second gaseous satellite struck Earth and more gently pushed Earth instead of shattering it. And so it pushed Earth out of its current orbit out of its old orbit to its current orbit, which is closer to the sun, where it could be warm enough to sustain life. Because out there where the asteroid belt is now, there's not enough sunlight to sustain life. And actually, in my reinterpretation of Genesis 1, it actually supports that idea, because when God moved, made the earth, it actually described as warming it, like he was rolling it into a place where it would be warmer. I think that's the biblical way of saying Earth was actually moved or rolled closer to the sun, where it could support life.
Well, that nudge helped us, didn't it?
What's that?
That nudge helped us a lot, didn't it?
Yeah. Without that, he was basically the events of Genesis and the interaction with the planet X was the way that God fine-tuned this planet so that it could be able to support life. He gave it its axial tilt, rotation rate, created the atmosphere, created the oceans. It was literally in one shot. He did all of this stuff that made it able to support life.
Based on my calculations, based on a planet that's 4.5 billion years old, and a universe that has this object coming around every 2,000 years rather, it has approached Earth 225,000 times, Doug, based on my calculations. Does it create havoc every time it comes by?
Well, since the last time it struck Earth, which was probably a very long time ago, it continues to orbit through where the Earth used to orbit. So it's perihelion, whereas now the asteroid belt, which contains the rocky remnants of Earth that did not stay in Earth's orbit. So the satellites of the asteroids in the asteroid belt are actually remnants of ancient Earth. And so it only goes as far as the asteroid belt, so it doesn't really come close anymore. It becomes a brilliant apparition in the sky, and it has some minor gravitational influence, maybe as much as Jupiter does, which is about 1% of all gravity. And so it has some small effect on tides, but not much. The real danger of Planet X is it has a huge amount of asteroids and comets and just junk in its orbital path that it carried with it when after the impact with Earth. It took a lot of that material which had been floating in space with it. And so when Planet X returns, it's both preceded and followed by massive amounts of asteroids and comets. And as it passes by the outer planets, some of that stuff might be pulled out of its orbit and basically shot into the inner solar system like buckshot.
Wow.
And so as a result, we have it's called the Day of the Lord, not only because it's a 2,000-year day, but also because it's a day of judgment, because there's huge amounts of asteroids flying through the inner solar system, and the chance of us being hit by those asteroids goes way up. And so every 2,000 years you have a day of judgment, and also literally it's a day of the Lord, as in the day of the Lord is 1,000 years, and 1,000 years is one day. The one day of the Lord in that sense is 2,000 years. And it also would give us a number for the original day, creation days in Genesis 1. They weren't one literal solar day. They were actually 2,000 years.
Doug, we're going to take a quick break here and come back and talk about giants and the riddle of the Sphinx, and later on your predictions about biblical prophecy and what's happening in Europe when we come back. Up next with Doug Elwell, we'll talk about giants, we'll talk about the riddle of the Sphinx, and we'll talk about what's happening in Europe and how it ties into biblical prophecy as well. And then next hour, we will take your calls here with him on Coast to Coast AM. And welcome back to Coast. George Noory with Doug Elwell. His book is called Planet X. He's also got one called Mysterious World. Doug, you working on anything else?
I'm the perennial working on my Giants book guy. It's been about 10 years now, I think. I do apologize to people. But, yeah, it's such a labor of love, and I have so many other things to work on that I keep putting it off. But, the Giants book is hopefully get done within the next year or two. Hopefully by the end of next year for sure. And it'll answer a lot of the questions about the origin of the giants, but also the origin of the fallen angels and also the creation of the universe and the ultimate purpose of its existence. And so that's not something you can take lightly, so I have to make sure, theologically speaking, that it's just right, so as not to confuse people.
When we talk about giants, what are we talking about?
The giants were developed or created by the fallen angels to aid them in their war against God. Now, they were outnumbered. If we take the number I mentioned previously, one-third of the angels are dragged down by the dragon. That means it's a 2-to-1 advantage for the good angels against the bad ones. And so in order to improve their odds, the fallen angels intermarried with women, as described in Genesis 6, and created giants. And so then those giants, they also gave gifts of technology and knowledge and education. It talks about in the book of Enoch how the fallen angels came down and taught men all the arts and sciences and what we would call technology. And so the giants of the world before the flood may have been fairly advanced, possessing weapons like guns, possibly even nuclear weapons. People have speculated that there was possibly even a nuclear war going on right before the flood, and the flood was sent partly to stop it and to wash away all the pollutions of the giants. Enoch actually talks about how the giants were polluting the entire world, and even though it's not really possible to do that with biological and chemical weapons, with nuclear weapons you could do that. And so with the description in some of the Indian texts of radioactive cities and people being destroyed by a heavenly spear filled with all the power of the sun, which burned entire villages, is a perfect description of nuclear weapons. And so it's possible that nuclear weapons did exist in the past, and they were used by the giants in their wars against each other for conquest of the earth.
Robert Oppenheimer, our father of the nuke age, believed that there were ancient atomic weapons used.
That's right. He even quoted, I think it was at the Rig Veda, the Mahabharata, "I have become death to destroy our worlds." That is one of the Indian gods said when he launched his weapon, that he actually was unable to unleash the power of the sun to destroy his enemies, and that's pretty much an exact description of nuclear weapons.
Absolutely.
And so we then, as now, have to make sure that we don't fall back into that same trap of thinking that ruling over others is a desirable thing, because inevitably it leads to weapons of mass destruction and the pollution of the earth itself.
We talk about giants, Doug. How tall are we talking here?
No, the giants are actually, there was a couple of different classes of giants. The original ones, the Nephilim, were the huge direct offspring of the giants. Cain was probably the first one. He was the very first giant, the son of Adam and Eve. I believe that probably Cain's, probably what happened was that when the Satan deceived Eve, he probably took one of her eggs and modified it so it was giant genetics. And so when she gave birth to Cain, Cain was much larger than usual and also enhanced in various ways. And from that line of Cain came the line of giants, which over time more and more fallen angels came down and interbred with their daughters and continued to modify this line until it's very different from the line of Seth, which is what we will call Homo sapiens. It became over time in the world before the flood that the entire world had become polluted, not only in terms of the earth itself and the waters becoming polluted physically, but also the genetics were being polluted. Also, it even talks about in the book of Enoch and other texts that the giants sinned against not only the humans, but also the animals and the plants, indicating that they had genetically modified them so that they were significantly different from the original design that God had created sometime early in history. And it came to the point that everything was so out of line and out of balance that it was all screwed up, basically. And so God had to come down and destroy that original creation and save 8 in the ark, along with probably all the clean animals and some unclean, I believe it was, and sort of root animals from which our existing animals have evolved. Probably took some plants too, even though I don't know if it was necessary.
Right.
But that was basically the world before the flood had become so polluted and so damaged because of the modifications that had to be destroyed. It wasn't just because of the evil. The original creation was so altered that it was lost and had to be destroyed totally.
Where did they go? What happened to them?
That's a good question. The ones that weren't destroyed, I suspect some of them managed to escape into space or go underground. Some of them, for example, the Hopi said that some of the underground dwellers called the Ant People, the Hopi Indians and Native Americans of southwestern United States, they actually escaped underground into these underground kivas where they waited out the flood. And there's another one. They had a Noah-like story where they actually went to one ark-like boat and managed to escape the floodwaters too. The Hopi cosmology and their history is actually remarkably similar to that of the Bible. And other peoples around the earth all have, almost all of them have the flood story with the ark and everything. It's very interesting. It's one of the only truly universal stories. But the giants themselves may have gone underneath the earth or actually gone into space. I mean, there's some people believe that they might have actually had the ability to do space travel. And as part of the war against God, they were actually creating what we call spacecraft that were able to escape Earth and survive to fight another day.
Are they tied into the fallen angels at all?
The fallen angels are basically divine beings that either took on retained their angelic form, or possibly created the giants specifically so they could have a body to inhabit, so they could interact with the physical world. Because spirits don't have the ability to interact with the physical world. They're
right.
Kind of a different frequency. The physical world is kind of a lower frequency, I guess you could say. So in order to interact with the grosser nature of the physical world, they had to take on a physical body that could do that. So in order to do that, that's why they kind of made a deal with Eve, so they could have a line of humanity that was their own, that they could use. And that was the line of Cain, which was owned by and kind of controlled by these fallen angels that they used for their own purposes.
Well, with Doug Elwell, we're going to take calls next hour with Doug. Plus, we'll talk a little bit about biblical prophecy and how that ties into what's happening in Europe right now. Doug, the Riddle of the Sphinx, what is that?
The Riddle of the Sphinx was an interesting little side project I came up with. When I was doing some work on the giants, I came up with some very interesting understanding of the Ark of the Covenant as a communications device, and really basically an extremely advanced piece of technology, advanced yet very simple. And in the process of studying the Ark, I came across this interesting object known as the Tsohar. It's Tsohar, and it's basically a different kind of communication device, similar to the Ark of the Covenant, except it preceded the Ark. And it is basically, when I went into the some of the prophecies of Moses and of Jacob regarding the 12 tribes in the end times, I decoded some of these ciphers and determined that the prophecy regarding Judah, the predecessor of the Jews, he actually found something underneath the Sphinx. He and the tribe of Gad. If you reinterpret the prophecies, it actually says in the prophecy of Gad that he actually dug underneath the Sphinx's paw and found a secret passage underneath the Sphinx. And in that side of that chamber, in the secret chamber underneath the Sphinx, he found something that was called the Lawgiver's Stone. And it was actually something that could be used to communicate with God, very similar with the Ark of the Covenant. So I follow that kind of idea to think that possibly this stone, which was basically kind of the proto-Ark before the Ark of the Covenant, was once used by mankind to communicate with God, and will be found again in the end times. And it is currently buried underneath the Sphinx, where it's been there, really for many thousands of years, possibly placed down there to avoid destruction by the flood. This is probably what Edgar Cayce was talking about when he said the Hall of Records. It wasn't made of papyrus or chiseled stone tablets. It was actually an extremely sophisticated and very advanced form of storage using transparent sapphire stones that were lens-shaped. Basically, they're what is called an optical hard drive, where you can use a laser to write to and read from it. And the sapphire is the second hardest stone next to diamond. And so this was basically a permanent form of data storage that would last for literally millions of years. And it's been sitting underneath the Sphinx, possibly occasionally brought out for use. I think probably Joseph figured out what it was and was able to use it and delve into its knowledge. I think Solomon probably knew it. When he said there's nothing new under the sun, I believe he was actually accessing the data from this hard drive and he learned everything he learned about advanced technology, and he was able to do some very advanced stuff during his time as ruler of Israel. And that's how he was able to do it, is he got that technology from the Tsohar stone, which is basically what we would call a supercomputer, but it was also AI sentient and extremely intelligent. Possibly, it might even be what was called the lapis exilis, or the stone of exile. There's a story in esoteric literature about how when Satan was thrown down from heaven, Michael had struck the stone from his helmet or from his crown, and that stone, which held massive amounts of knowledge, fell to earth and became the subject of a great search. One of my theories was that the giants were actually created to help Satan find that stone and properly guard it. And so the stone, which was so powerful, it had to be carefully guarded because whoever had possession of it would give such a huge advantage in terms of capabilities and knowledge. They would be able to literally conquer the world. And I suspect throughout history, various rulers who have found this stone, including possibly King David, actually tried to conquer the earth. There was actually there was a passage, a very strange passage in the Bible where David started numbering the armies of Israel. And God said to him, "You cannot do that. And I'm going to punish you because you tried to do that because you misused the power I gave you." I suspect what he did is he had actually found this stone and had used its knowledge to learn technology and learn about basically how the world works and effectively give him such a huge advantage. He was going to try to conquer the earth using Israel's armies. But this is not what God wanted. So he ended up causing a great destruction to happen to Israel as punishment to David. And I suspect he used the stone to do that.
Where might the stone be now?
The stone is probably underneath the Sphinx where it's kept stored. This is part of the reason they're absolutely refusing to let people dig underneath the Sphinx, is because it's being kept there probably by an ancient secret society, kind of like the Brotherhood of the Cruciform Sword from Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade.
How big is it, do you think, Doug?
It is actually probably 1 cubit in diameter and probably a couple of spans in width. It's basically, if you've seen the goddess Hathor, that she has that red disc on her head, or the god Re in Egyptian cosmology, I believe that's the same thing. It's they're wearing the Zohar stone on their head, and you can use it to wear it on your head as sort of a direct interface between the computer and your brain. It actually read-write to your brain directly. And the people of the ancient past, the priestesses of Hathor or the priests of Re, would actually wear this thing in their head, and it would actually train them to have knowledge and understanding, and also godlike powers. Those you see those gods and goddesses, they're actually not gods and goddesses. What they were men and women who were in possession of high technology that gave them godlike power. And the Zohar stone was just one of many pieces of equipment, which I believe there's actually a number of different pieces, like a special girdle, like a gown called the ketonet, and you probably heard of the ketonet, and things of that nature, that when all put together makes one invincible. I suspect the Antichrist will be able to find all of these pieces, put them all together, and when he puts them all on, he'll become invincible and will be able to conquer the world. And that's what happens probably in the middle of the tribulation period, when he finds this stuff and puts it all together and begins his conquest, not only of the world, but also an attempt to challenge Jesus himself.
What makes the stone so powerful, Doug?
What it is, it's like its offensive capabilities. What it is, it's effectively a communications device that also has massive data storage. And it has lasers that read to and write from it. Those lasers are extraordinarily powerful. If you turn the lasers outwards, you could actually use them as very powerful weapons. And I suspect that the Ark of the Covenant was the same way. The Ark of the Covenant, the 2 tablets within the Ark were actually not granite, carved granite. They were actually sapphire stones, just like the Zohar.
This material, okay.
Yeah, same principle, same concept. And actually, I got that idea.
Probably what turned Moses' face white, huh?
It could, well, his hand, yeah, actually, that's related. That might have to do with the monatomic gold, which is actually another technology having to do with the Ark of the Covenant. I've found a lot of breakthroughs, and I put a lot of this stuff in the book, The Riddle of the Sphinx, because I wanted to make sure it was written down somewhere rather than waiting for the Giants book to get published. I wanted to have that written down. So I actually published that back in 2012, if you can believe that. So a lot of the information about some of the esoterica and the technology related to the Ark of the Covenant, and also I think I mentioned that Zohar as well. Zohar will figure prominently in the Book of the Giants because it's one of the most important objects that they were specifically created to find and guard. It has to do with sapphire stone technology, monatomic gold, and some other stuff that was basically high technology from the world before the flood.
If somebody went out and just got a little sapphire and put it in their pocket, would they have any special properties with that?
I don't know. It's a good question. It might have a local effect just because it exists and has a certain electromagnetic signature, but you're thinking of magic, which might be possible. But I'm thinking of it in terms of technology. The stone itself is made. It's aluminum oxide compressed, and so it's the same stuff that they use in the chemtrails too, which is interesting. A sapphire is basically compressed aluminum oxide, I believe, and so it doesn't occur naturally transparent. But one that was used to store data would have to be transparent, so you'd have to be able to create a transparent sapphire. Now we can create industrial diamonds. I could probably do industrial sapphires too, and in fact, optical hard drives made of sapphire do actually exist, and so the technology is sound and it works. And optical hard drives using sapphire will be the next generation storage medium.
Doug, when we come back at the top of the hour, let's chat about your thoughts on biblical prophecy and what's happening in Europe right now. And, of course, with you, up next with Doug Elwell, we're going to take phone calls and also talk about his thoughts on biblical prophecy and what's happening between Ukraine and Russia right now. It will amaze you when we come back. And welcome back to Coast. George Noory with you, Doug Elway with us. Elwell. Would you prefer, Doug, Elwell or Elway?
Actually, the original pronunciation was Halewell. It actually means holy well. It's an English name.
Good for you. All right, you've been looking at the Ukraine situation in light of biblical prophecy. What have you uncovered?
Now, my studies and various articles about the giants, and also in my book, Mysterious Rhode Island, I looked into the ancient ancestors of the Irish. And it turns out that the ancient ancestors of the Irish were a people called the Scythians, and they descended in turn from the Magogians. And they actually emanated from what is the area around the Ukraine region and that entire area. There used to be horse archers, very good ones, so effective that not even Xerxes the Great of Persia could defeat them because they knew how to do hit-and-run type warfare and were able to defeat even the largest armies using their horse archers. Now, they actually dominated the steppe for thousands of years and actually were able to defeat the Gomerians or Cimmerians, whom they ended up driving west into Germany and south into Armenia and southwest into Turkey. In the Bible, in the Genesis 10, the Table of Nations, the descendants of the sons of Noah were Shem, Ham, and Japheth. You're probably familiar with that.
Yeah.
From the Japhethites came from Gomer and Magog, including Madai, Yawan, Tubal, Meshach, and Tiras. And most of these names show up in Ezekiel 38 as part of a coalition of forces that will move south and attack Israel unsuccessfully. The first two, Gomer and Magog, I believe are actually the famous Gog and Magog. Gomer actually is named shortened to Gog, so it rhymes with Magog. In Ezekiel 38 and 39, there's a mysterious reference to a leader called the Gog of the land of Magog. And now I did some research into Vladimir Putin years ago. I read a short article called Gog's Ring from MysteriousWorld.com. It's under the fragments section. And I actually did research into his background. And it turns out he is actually, his household actually spoke German natively. And as part of the reason Vladimir Putin actually was put in when he was in the KGB, actually worked East Germany because he spoke German fluently. And some of the people theorized he was actually part of a group of Germans. His ancestors were part of a group of Germans who were brought in by Catherine the Great to bring in an artisan class that could grow in Moscow. And so he might actually be of German ancestry. If so, as a Gomerian or German Gog, he would actually fulfill on the idea that of a German ruling over the land of the Russians, because the Gomerians were the Germans and the Magogians were the Russians and actually the Ukrainians too. The name Rus actually comes from a tribe of Vikings that came southeast from, I think it was Sweden, but that's where they get the name. But they're actually a mixture of Vikings and also Magogians, descendants of Japheth. And so that entire region where we're having the turmoil now is actually Magogic in nature. And Magog is actually prominently featured in Ezekiel 30 and 39. And Gog is the leader. And so Gog would be a German in charge of the Russians, which is exactly what we have right now.
Is that what Putin is?
He is apparently German, and he would fulfill on that criteria if the Gomerians, or Gog is actually short for Gomerian, who is the ancestor of the Germans. We might actually have a German in charge of the Russians, and that will fulfill on that criteria of Gomer or Gog being chief of the land of Magog. Putin will fulfill on that. And if he does what he wants to do, which is reform all the USSR and bring all these groups, like it talks about in Ezekiel 30 and 39, it's a coalition basically of the Turks, the Russians, possibly some Magogians, also the Armenians and the Iranians, and also people from Sudan, Libya, and other areas. They all combined forces to attack Israel in the end times. If so, if he tries to bring together all of these forces, he might fulfill on the Ezekiel 38, 39 prophecy, which might be a precursor to the end times, and even a setup for the necessity of a sort of a new world order to prevent this sort of thing from happening again. So if Putin continues to put together the coalition and continue to conquer the old USSR and bring it back together, and then begins to move south, and he probably will because they already have forces in Syria just north of the border of Israel. In fact, I recently saw an article where the Russians actually claim that they own the Golan Heights, not Israel anymore. They're actually challenging Israel over their sovereign territory. So look for some conflict in that area as well.
Might Putin, Doug, be the Antichrist?
No, Putin is Gog. The Antichrist, I think, is a different character, probably a Western leader. In the book of Daniel, it talks about how there's a Western leader who is fighting against the king of the north and the king of the south, and also the kings of the east. And so that leaves the west as unaccounted for. So that leader, talk to you about the book of Daniel, is probably a Western leader. Some people think he's from Europe. He might be American. It's not really clear. But it would appear that, based on what Daniel says, is northern, southern, and eastern kings are in conflict with this willful king who, very much like a Greek king. And he actually comes after some of the Greek kings in the narrative of Daniel. It's kind of sort of a revival with this old Greek king and Antiochus Epiphanes, who took the place of Alexander after he died and ruled over Palestine for a time. He was known for desecrating the temple by sacrificing a swine on the altar. And the Antichrist would do something similar, but instead of sacrificing a swine, which he might do, he'll sit himself in the Holy of Holies of the temple and proclaim himself to be God. And so the Antichrist will be a person from the West who will not try to destroy Israel, but conquer it and take it over and become the king of the Jews, the king of Israel, try to fulfill on the prophecies of the Messiah. And it sort of preempts Jesus' return and say, you're not the Messiah, I am. And then after that happens, there'll be a fight between Jesus and the Antichrist as to who is actually the king of the universe.
These are scary times, Doug.
If so, yes, there's going to be a lot of conflict in that region. It won't really touch us, but it will affect the economies of the entire world. For example, a large percentage of the grain in the world is created in Russia and Ukraine. And if we lose that grain...
it looks like we're going to.
Yeah, they'll fulfill on the prophecy or one of the seals. I think it's the third seal. Yeah, where the grain is very short. It says, a day's wage for barley and 3 days for wheat or something like that. But it says, do not harm the oil and wine. What that is it says only the wheat and the barley will increase in price, but the prices of everything else will stay about the same, indicating that the famine is not universal. Not all foods will become short, just grains, because probably the war in Ukraine and Russia will create a worldwide shortage, which will have a cascading effect around the world.
Do you think there's anybody within Russia that would get together as a group and oust Putin? I've heard that that's possible.